Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today. Apparently the discourse is all about a comment that Charlie Kirk made in like a speech or something. I don't know, I don't follow the guy, but all I've seen online right now is all this talk about sexual anarchy, and it's been attributed to the following Charlie Kirk clip. Now, I'm not going to play the clip just yet because I feel like there's a couple things that we should be focusing on a lot more rather than just memeing about sexual anarchy. So yes, hi, I'm fun at parties. I want to break apart all the various ways in which Charlie Kirk is saying very dangerous and also untrue and sometimes weirdly true things all throughout this clip. It is all over the place. I cannot get a read on this guy at all. Now again, the only time I've really known about Charlie Kirk has been his whole, I live my life as a capitalist clip. That, and of course the memes about the small face and Turning Point USA, those are basically the only context in which I know of Charlie Kirk. So the following clip is really my first glance at who Charlie Kirk is as a person. And so with that, let's go point by point through this clip of his.
And I think these comments from Chuck Schumer are important because I want every Republican out there to realize that when the Democrats are winning, they are rubbing it in our face. And some Democrat senators, some Republican senators are now coming up and they are stunned. How dare he do this? You think we're still living in the same country, don't you? Senators from South Dakota, Senator Portman, you think we're still living in the 1980s where the Democrats actually want what's best for America? The Democrats want to destroy the country. We know this. This is not new stuff. It's not profound thinking.
So when exactly are the Democrats winning? Because judging from the left, they sure seem to lose an awful lot of the time. So first off, right, like that's a misrepresentation in terms of, oh, when the Democrats win, they just love to rub it in our faces. I feel like that's really not the case when the Democrats are constantly trying to be conciliatory towards Republicans and extend a cooperative olive branch, and Republicans basically never do the same in kind. This is basically a kind of pot meets kettle situation. But the very scary part was the second part of that segment of the clip where he's saying, you think we're still living in the same country. So you're not? Like, what is the point of saying that unless your goal is to try and foment further division and rejection of quote-unquote authority when it doesn't suit you? Last I checked, Charlie boy, there are actually 50 United States. That includes the states that, unfortunately, don't like the current guy in charge. And yes, for those wondering, that also applied under Trump, the terrible, awful presidency that preceded Biden's equally terrible, awful presidency. I'm beginning to notice a pattern here. What purpose does Charlie Kirk have mentioning, oh, this is not the same country, unless he has some kind of motive, which then raises the question, what's the motive? Are you trying to make it so that America does come to a civil war and people seriously entertain splitting the country apart? If so, just say what you mean, my guy. But I'm sure somehow this plays well with his audience and they'll just clap like seals and say, yeah, absolutely, Democrats terrible. We should totally leave and take all our money with us, says the person living in Montana. But I find it kind of weird that most of us just kind of skipped over the whole Charlie Kirk doesn't think he's living in a sane, rational country anymore, despite being part of the side that has actively enabled people to basically do the worst things in recent memory. Like, that's objectively true. Wasn't this asshole one of the many people who actually paid and like got sponsorships to bus people in for January 6th, the attempted insurrection basically at the Capitol building? And now here he is once again saying, oh, you think we're still living in the same country? These are actually really scary things, but I didn't see that be mentioned at all. Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't the 80s basically the Reagan years? Like just full solid Reaganomics, and then you also had George H.W. Bush after that. So in what way exactly were Democrats, wanting the best when Reagan and the Republicans kind of just controlled the whole joint? This makes no sense, and it's kind of trying to create this weird ahistorical narrative that would suit him and his supporters. Also, here's another thought, Charlie. maybe the Democrats do want what's best for America. It's just that what their supporters feel is best for America is at odds with what you think is what's best for America. That's a question worth exploring, as well as political divisions and how sometimes they can be reconciled, other times they absolutely cannot be. There's a real conversation there. But once again, I don't see anyone really bringing that up.
The Democrats want to destroy the country. We know this.
Democrats want to destroy the country. We know this. No, we don't. This is, again, that classic right-wing vitriolic fear-mongering and scaremongering of, they're all a bunch of Satan-worshipping pedophile baby eaters. It's like, no, that's the ruling class. And yes, the Democrats are part of the ruling class. Same with the Republicans, but I don't see people making that connection. And the way he just says is so matter-of-factly, like, we know this. Citation fucking needed, my guy. We believe in Medicare for all. Yeah, no, that's really destroying the country. America has a lot of really terrible problems that we should maybe begin addressing in order to help the American people. How dare you, you absolute traitors. Like, this is so absurd, and yet he's saying it with total confidence, convinced that it's real, and the scary thing is, probably a good chunk of his audience agree with him.
They want to see America completely obliterated, the Constitution shredded, and remade in their own San Francisco, Brooklyn, Malibu, Manhattan image.
Oh, you forgot to throw in Minneapolis and Portland in there as well. You know, better be sure you have your weird selective stereotype bases covered. Again, this clip increasingly feels like right-wing projection. You know, they're destroying the country. No, that's what you guys are doing. You literally tried that on January 6th. They want to shred the Constitution and remake it in their own image. That's Republicans and voting rights laws, hello? Everything this man says is incredibly frustratingly wrong. Or it's just blatantly untrue or unprovable. You know what's really destroying America, Charlie? Over 40 fucking years of neoliberal economics that have seen a record transfer of wealth upwards, but the trickle-down theory basically debunked year after year as time goes on, and millions more Americans suffering. That's what's destroying America, not any kind of appeals for sensibility or progress.
Where there is no cultural identity.
So the thing about cultural identity is that it is by its very nature fluid and changes with every successive generation as new influences are introduced to the culture, whether they come from like an internal revelation or an outside influence. This is why, you know, I've touched on this before. The idea of traditional Canada is bullshit because no such thing has ever existed, because every decade or so, what counts as traditional Canada changes. But to keep it focused on America, how is there no more cultural identity? You already just showed that you believe that there is a cultural identity by talking about Malibu, San Francisco, Brooklyn. And again, you forgot Portland and Minneapolis. There's the northeastern United States, you know, New England and all the waspy people up there, and clam chowder and racism and Boston. And then you have New York, literally the greatest city on earth, with its own unique thing going on and also several regional accents. And then, of course, you've got the Deep South and that whole cultural history. There's also still Black culture. Not that I'd expect you to know much about that. And remind me again, isn't there a group with brown skin, tends to come from south of the border with great food, hard workers, a language that I know and speak. They also come with Catholicism. You love to say that they're actually like worsening the country, even though they are definitely a net benefit and also still pay taxes. Right! Latin Americans! You know, that group that you and many other shit-heeled right-wingers love to talk about and denigrate and treat as literal invasive aliens as though they're from some other fucking planet. You've deliberately created several different others. You even listed some examples here in this clip. And here you are talking about, oh, there's going to be no more cultural identity. Bitch, please. You've clearly made a career talking about different cultural identities and why they're bad or wrong or ruining America.
Where you live in sexual anarchy.
And then, of course, we finally have the sexual anarchy. Now, Of course, in typical fashion, he just says it and doesn't actually elaborate on it. Sexual anarchy. So what? Like white people are barred from missionary position as the only position? Like, what is sexual anarchy to you? Gay people are allowed to hold hands and show affection in public. The world is gonna end. Like, what is sexual anarchy exactly? Ah, right. Here's something. It doesn't actually exist. That's one of those typical right-wing nebulous terms that are meant to instill fear in whoever the target audience is so that their mind creatively fills in the blanks. It's why you don't actually really detail a nightmarish terror. You vaguely define it or talk about it and say, it's really terrifying. Imagine the worst thing you can imagine. And then someone's like, and then for them, that's the worst thing they can imagine, right? That is why this whole segment here doesn't make any actual sense about sexual anarchy, because that is a stand-in for his audience and for people on the right and the far right who will watch this clip to, again, nod their heads of like, yeah, sexual anarchy, gay people, bad. This is absurd pearl clutching and it has no basis in reality.
For private property is a thing of the past, and the ruling class controls everything. We know this. And Schumer is willing to get there. Schumer is willing to get it done. Republicans are not. Republicans are trying to protect a country that no longer exists.
That bit about private property, though, oh man. A man can dream. But crucially, and weirdly so, the end of this clip is where he's actually, like, really close to getting it right, and in many ways does have it right, in a weird way. He's absolutely right in that the ruling class controls everything, but he fails to make the connection that the Republican Party is the other half of the actual ruling class that passes for democracy in the United States of America. That's why they are, quote, not fighting, and they're just rolling over and surrendering to the Democrats who are rubbing it in our faces. The Democrats do the same when the Republicans do stuff, because no matter who wins, well, actually, no, here's the thing. The ruling class always wins, which is why the American people consistently fucking lose. The Republicans aren't going to fight the Democrats on things that directly benefit the ruling class, of which they are members of and also receive copious amounts of public donation support from. The exact same thing is true of the Democrats. Charlie Kirk is, again, weirdly correct in that one brief moment talking about how the ruling class actually own and control everything. He just fails to also make the connection that the Republicans are also a part of that, specifically because that wouldn't sit well with his audience, which probably votes Republican en masse and supports a lot of the typical right-wing stuff. So he can't say the full total truth. He has to say what he knows will play well to his audience because man's got to make money. He's got to put food on the table. He's got a career to maintain. He wants them dollar bills, y'all. So truth dies in the face of capitalism, so Charlie Boy can get more money peddling blatant mistruths and occasionally touch on an absolute kernel of truth, but doesn't take it to the logical next step and point out how the whole system and game is totally rigged. And I think really at the end of the day, that's the crux of everything for me. That Charlie Kirk, just, if he actually were honest and perhaps a little more self-aware and saw the bigger picture, we maybe could potentially have Comrade Kirk, but we're not going to get that because this man is a right-winger and he has an audience to maintain. He believes wholeheartedly in capitalism, which, you know, it might be possible that he sees through the facade, or maybe he is very much a devoted cult worshiper of the cult of capitalism. It is entirely possible that he may not see how, oh, I don't understand, Republicans are, still trying to fight for a country that no longer exists. They never have. Just like the Democrats really never have, at least not since the neoliberal economic reformation, if you want to call it that, of the 1970s and the 1980s. He is so close to actually seeing the point, but he just can't quite get there because he is still so devoted to the system that is actually ruining America. And yet instead he's blaming all these other non-factors that will just get nodding heads from his audience of, yeah, this man absolutely right. And it is so unfortunate to see. And What really gets my gall is that I could make this whole thing out of a minute-long clip. Imagine everything else this man has said. And the other thing that really gets me is that what I've talked about here has been most of what's not the thing that's currently trending, which is the sexual anarchy bit. Of all the things that Charlie Kirk said and that we could take to task, we're memeing on sexual anarchy. You know what? That's what's bothering me today.